We now take you to the broadcast of It's Time with Rev Nathaniel W Martin. Here's Reverend Martin.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, but never good night, and certainly never goodbye. I am Rev Nathaniel W Martin, and we have a program, a podcast, an episodic program that we call It's Time. And what is it time for? Why, it's time for justice. What type of justice? Ecological, environmental, economic? Yes, by all means. That does include reparations, which is a taboo word in our culture or in our politics. But nevertheless, until this government, as an entire government, as a people, from sea to shining sea, from the mountain to the prairie, acknowledges the guilt of 246 years of unrequited toil, as Abraham Lincoln so eloquently described it in his second inauguration. Why, I don't think we'll ever get to the promised land of which Dr. King so eloquently spoke about on that fateful night there in Memphis, Tennessee. There must be a reckoning, and in that reckoning, there must be an honest accounting and an honest acknowledgement of debts owed, and an honest beginning effort to address the repatriation or the repayment of those debts owed. I believe Randall Robinson called it, we must make whole the person who has been so offended. And so since the slaves have passed on, but we who are the descendants of the slaves are yet here, then there is got to be a reckoning, a finding, and then a beginning of payment and making whole, a recompense, if you will, being made to the descendants of the slaves, of which I am one. I don't believe we can possibly hope to become all that we would be if we fail to acknowledge our past. After all, the past is prologue. And if you look at all of the policies that have flowed from the U.S. government and the state governments since the abolition of slavery, then we can see that slavery has impacted all of those policies because of the point of view, because of the value that was placed upon human life by those who were privileged and benefited, and who were the beneficiaries of that slavery. And they had no, what you call, inclination to make things right, because it would mean they have to give up some of the things that they have prided themselves on owning and having. And once you own a person and have subjected that person, remember that the Black's Law Book back in the day said that a slave was a human being which legally was not a person. And so you can draw your own conclusions from that. But that's a pretty tough hill to climb when you're not viewed as a person. No wonder the Dred Scott decision was stated as it was worded by Chief Justice Roger Taney and that majority of that court. And it's no wonder that many of the subsequent decisions, even following the Civil War, have still not recognized the personhood or the humanity of the colored people who are now called black people or African Americans, as the case may be. That is what we address. That is what we confront. That is what the issue is. And to those of you that say, well, hard work would take care of it, hey, if hard work was all it took, then every slave coming out of slavery would have been a millionaire. So hard work by in and of itself is no virtue. All right. Let us look at the scriptures that form our bases for our discussions. Deuteronomy chapter 24, beginning at verse 14, says these words. Let me move back. Thou shalt not oppress an hired servant that is poor and needy, whether they be of thy brethren or of thy strangers that are in thy land within thy gate. At their day thou shalt give them their hire, neither shall the sun go down upon it, for they are poor, and set their hearts upon it, lest they cry out against thee unto the Lord, and it be sin unto thee. And so those who withhold from the black man, or from the colored people, or from the descendants of the slaves, or from the oppressed, that which is their just due, in this case reparation, are continuing the oppression that their ancestors, their forefathers, have wreaked upon the land. And Abraham Lincoln said we were guilty on a bloody land, guilty land, as a result of the pernicious and insidious tentacles of slavery. And so we have a much to atone for. We noticed that in our week just now ending, that the great, or now infamous, notorious Kanye West, let us not confuse him with Cornell. The great Kanye West was in the White House with his favorite mentor, Donald J. Trump, and he had a lot to say, which made him quite different. His philosophy, his approach is quite different from a Cornel West. Mr. Kanye West, who is a comedian, who is a rap star, a very successful hip-hop artist who has made billions in records and billions in endorsements, so that he doesn't need the money. But yet we found him, we observed him, we saw him engaging in what can be called a minstrel show in the Oval Office. And at one point, the President of the United States asked him, how did it feel to be in the Oval Office? Of which Kanye West said, oh, you can just feel this great good energy. One of the some of the other critics of Kanye West meeting with President Trump has observed that it was not enough just to be in the room, not enough to be at the table, but it's what are you saying at the table? What are you saying at the table? And while we could go on in remonstrance against this minstrel show, let us say that it was at the least cringeworthy, which was an understatement. And if you're a black person in America, you couldn't help but have a visceral reaction to what we observed in the Oval Office. And I'm sure all of you have seen the video of Jim Brown and Kanye West, who were in a meeting with President Donald Trump. And Kanye had attempted to get other blacks to come and join him in meeting with the president. He tried to get Colin Kaepernick, but Colin Kaepernick said no. He tried to get some of the popular DJs like Ebro. Ebro said no. To come with him and serve as window dressing, as it were, for his obeisance. No other way to explain his obeisance that he lavished and paid unto President Trump, saying in one hand that we've got to hold the president up, and because he represents all of us, and that type of logic which glosses over too many wrongs. Nobody can afford to be a groupie, a presidential groupie. We found that out with President Clinton or President Obama. You cannot afford just to be a groupie. Everything's all right. No, you can't afford just to say we're so happy, so glad to be here. No, that's not enough. What are you there for? You must be there for something. You must be there for a reason. You never saw or never even heard of such a thing in the days of Ace Philip Randolph or Dr. William L. Trotter or Martin Luther King Jr. or even Mary McLeod Bethune. You never heard of such a thing as them groveling and embracing the president, just hugging up on the president as though he's done such great things for black people. And it is to laugh. It is really to beg the question, what has Donald Trump benefited black people in America? That you have one of the greatest hip-hop artists, indeed, one of the greatest thinkers. I think he has a 98 percentile intellect by his own boast, based upon the Tesla and the other measuring program that which he was subjected to, according to him, by his therapist or his psychiatrist. And yet, as the scripture says, great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. Just because a person look like you don't mean they like you, and doesn't mean that you got to go along with everything that they do. If you look at the difference between Thurgood Marshall, whom you could follow, and look at his successor, one Clarence Thomas, who makes you cringe, the difference could not be more stark. The differences could not be more dramatic. And what I am getting at about this Kanye West thing is that what did we as black people get out of it? What did the nation get out of it? We know that there's going to be a lot of guffawing and chortling and backslapping on behalf of the conservative, ultra-conservative wing of the Republican Party at the groveling, the seemingly verbal groveling that Kanye West did before President Donald Trump. I'm sure even Cornel West, who is no relation, mind you, would have to cringe at this dear brother portraying himself and displaying himself on national, international, global television, as he did at his interview in the White House. Now, it must be said that while he does not represent all black people, that the white majority defines the majority of black people through the prism of the leaders or so-called leaders that they observe, especially when you get to the Oval Office. You'll have a witness. And again, it comes down to what are you saying when you are at the table? What are you advocating for when you are at the table, when you have the ear of the president of the United States. What are you saying? You know, when blind Bartimaeus sitting by the side of the road was found out that he had the ear of the Savior of the world, he had a request. He had an intelligent, sensible request. He asked that he might receive sight. Looked to me as though Kanye West squandered a great opportunity to speak up on behalf of the incarcerated, although he did make some wandering, meandering references to the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which outlaws slavery except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. And he's had his solution was that now we should eliminate the 13th Amendment, which I think would be a very big mistake given the tenor of our current culture. You'd be back in slavery in the morning if you got rid of the 13th Amendment. Once you abolish the amendment that abolished slavery in America, you better look out. And so I feel that Mr. West was quite confused. Again, Kanye West was quite confused. He says, call him Ye. And my God, Ye, what a mess you made in those few, I think that 10-minute rant. It almost set us back 200 years. To his credit, it says that he was trying to work through his father-son issues, and he looks upon Donald Trump as a father figure. In fact, he gave him a hug. Oh, Jesus, have mercy. It makes you wonder, where is Mr. Kanye West emotionally? And he even acknowledged that he has had mental illness, mental problem, but bipolar person wouldn't justify his actions, and neither would sleep deprivation justify his behavior. He did mention stop and frisk, but feebly. And as you know, that stop and frisk has been ruled illegal by the court of the United States of America. That it's illegal to stop and frisk people for no reason. And then he talked about bringing jobs to America, bringing jobs to Chicago. I said he talked about it. I'm being charitable when I said he talked about it, because he didn't really talk about bringing jobs to America. He was more or less engaged in encomiums, if you will, and in admiration of President Trump. And that seemed to be the entire extent of his tirade, to show Donald Trump just how much he loved him and admired him, which is nothing wrong with being a supporter of President Donald Trump. Each one must have his own political persuasion, his own political agenda. Now, let's go back to what he said, speaking of Kanye West, about the 13th Amendment. Says we don't have reparations, but we have the 13th Amendment. Now, reparations would have given us a better opportunity coming out of slavery than we had. If they had paid the slaves instead of paying the slave masters, America would have been different, because our people would have had something to move forward with. As I said, if hard work was a virtue all by itself, then every slave coming out of slavery would have been a millionaire. Isn't that right? And, there are letters and communiques that you can read between the former slaves and the former slave masters following the Civil War, where the slave master would find out where some of the slaves had gone, and they were trying to get them to come back to the farm, back to the plantation. And one former slave sent to his former master and said, now, looked like we were working there for about, so many dollars an hour. And we had how many years of labor down there. So now if you send us back that amount of recompense, then we'll think about coming back down there and working for you again. Because I think they had worked for the man for 20-odd years, all day. And, wages at that time probably amounted to about $2 or $3 a day times 20 years. You can figure that out for yourself. 365 days a year, you out there working for nothing for 20, 30 years. And he was very cute. He said, now, if you would send that back to me and Sally Mae, then we would consider coming back down there and working for you again. So right now, we're doing fine. That reparation would have been cheap back then. But as Kanye West said, we didn't get reparation, but we have the 13th Amendment. He said we got to open up the whole conversation, and that's a move. One of the moves that I love that liberals try to do, and the liberals would try to control a black person through the concept of racism because they know that we are very proud, emotional people. So when I said I like Trump, to like someone that's liberal, they'll say, oh, but he's racist. You think racism could control me? Well, that don't stop me. That's an invisible wall. Well, let's unpack that. Because racism has had its insidious hand in our pockets ever since slavery, and ever since slavery was established in these here United States of America. And ever since slavery was abolished, racism has had its hand in our pocket. And racism is different from bigotry. Racism is different from prejudice. Racism is a system or structure by which those that are in power control those who are not in power. And if you don't think racism has controlled our politics, has controlled our economics, controlled our education, has controlled our hospitalization, it has controlled where the type of work that we were able to get, the type of position that we were able to aspire or to achieve, while even just this radio, to go back to the commemoration service of Brother Johnny Marsh, going to find out that black folks really had to just kick the door down to radio broadcasting. You had to build your own transmitter, build your own turntable, and all of that thing in order to be in radio, because there was no room for blacks in radio. There was no room being made for blacks, especially black engineers. Yeah, you could get in front of the microphone and put on a minstrel show, but you couldn't be working in the background where the real power was, working with the transmitters and working with the machinery and the technology, analog at that time, though it may have been. Even now, you can still see racism at work, not only in front of the camera, which is more blatant than ever, but also behind the camera, the stage set. Matter of fact, in order to keep black people from aspiring and achieving, they've gone to robots, where you used to have a cameraman that moved that camera around. Now you can set the camera up on a platform and program that platform to move and rotate. Hey, you don't even need, they're getting rid of the cameraman now. But I digress. The point is that racism has been far more insidious than we give credence and awareness to. And even in radio, let alone in television, the barriers have been many. But that's just to speak of radio and television. But we speak of them because those are where a lot of our images are formulated. Right? Remember, Birth of a Nation was a movie. put out by Mr. Dixon, and I forget the other guy's name at this moment, that portrayed blacks in a very negative light. Is that right? Griffin was his name. Portrayed blacks in a very negative light. Negative. And those images, those caricatures are still carried in the subconscious mind of many of our white brothers and sisters, even to this very hour. And it was to paint all black people with the same brush. You see, when we talk about Jeffrey Dahmer and his depredations and wickedness, we only speak about Jeffrey Dahmer. We don't put that on all white people because we got better sense than that. But when white people look at us and they see one of our people doing wrong, then they say all of us are guilty of that same thing. And that is the effect and the impact of implicit racism and implicit bigotry and bias that is still at work in our land. I had wanted to mention the 13th Amendment, which outlawed slavery. And of course, it said basically, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a what? Punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So even Dr. Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens and that ilk and Abraham Lincoln, who fostered the very idea of the 13th Amendment, retain slavery if you did a crime. If you did a crime, you go back in slavery. And so these thoughts trouble me when I see a great opportunity squandered as that chance that Kanye West had, that platform that he had. And we thank God that there are other voices out there which are not Kanye West, who are not having daddy issues or mental issues. And while it makes me cringe to see a black man calling a white man his daddy, if that's the way he is, that's the way he is. But at least, you know, he's not my daddy. He's just Kanye West's daddy figure. And my Lord, how embarrassing such things are. You know, in this modern day and culture, I'm not quite sure how old Kanye West is. I'm 70, but I know he's much younger than I. But look like he could do better than that, you know? Was there no black man that he could call his daddy? Oh, my Savior. And to be on the shoulder of the president, of Donald Trump. Oh, Jesus. And the look in Jim Brown's eye said it all. You know, why, it was a minstrel show. It was a total travesty. It was a whitewash. Our young children should be ashamed, and it must not be led to believe is that the way all of us think. You know, I thought Uncle Tom was dead, you know, Jim Crow, Uncle Remus and all that stuff was behind us. But here we got somebody who doesn't even have a dog in the fight. He's a multi-millionaire. There's no money Trump can give him. You know, Mantan Moreland, Willie Best and all of that crowd, at least we could say that they were trying to make an honest living, trying to hold on to a position. The lady that we denigrate many times, Hattie McDaniel, you know, those people at least had an agenda in mind. They had a purpose, a point, an end game. They were trying to survive for their daily living. This man didn't need to be hugging up on Trump for a daily living, so why was he doing it? You know, what was the justification? So, and again, as I say, and I'm going to wrap it up, Dr. King never lived that way. He never groveled before Lyndon Baines Johnson. He never groveled before John Fitzgerald Kennedy. None of the civil rights leaders did that. Nobody took pictures with hugging up with the President of the United States as though he was some great Lord and Master, some great deliverer. Remember, Martin Luther King Jr. Died because he turned against Johnson and the Civil War. At the time Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, he was one of the most despised men in the civil rights movement. Even his own people were turned against him because he had turned against Lyndon Baines Johnson. And now contrast that with this very successful, very rich, multi-millionaire entrepreneur with a very 98% percentile intellect, and yet he grovels at the feet of Donald J. Trump. Why, what a contrast. What a come down. Thank God that our other leaders did not follow that perception or that philosophy. They stood up like men. They spoke up like men. They demanded like champions, and that's why we can celebrate them today. As Franklin Delano Roosevelt said to A. Philip Randolph, I agree with you, now make me do it. But you never saw Randolph die.